Hi, I'm Sarah Soliz, Director of SAR Press, and I want to welcome you all to our virtual book talk series. Today, we're joined by Phillip Gonzales, Renato Rosaldo, and Mary Louise Pratt, who will be helping me to celebrate the publication of Trumpism, Mexican America, and the Struggle for Latinx Citizenship, which is the newest volume in our advanced seminar series. As we talk, I want to remind everyone in the audience to type all of your questions into the Q&A, and I will share them as we go. Before we jump into the conversation, I'm going to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their work. Mary Louise, would you like to go first?
Yes. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Mary Louise Pratt. I work in the areas of comparative literature and Latin American studies. And I taught for many years at Stanford, and the last part of my career I spent at New York University in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis.
Renato?
I'm Renato Rosaldo. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I've taught many years at Stanford and more recently at NYU. And I've in recent years taken up what I call anthropoetry, and I've written about my high school gang and various other things. And I think it's helped my writing in general, and that's all I'll say for now.
Felipe?
Hello, I'm Phillip Gonzales, and I'm Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of New Mexico. I retired there after 30 years of service. I'm a trained sociologist, although much of my work is historical, and the bulk of it has focused on the political experience of the no-Mexicanos going back to the 18th century. So that's been a major project of mine. I retired 2 years ago. Nevertheless, I had 3 books in my computer in various stages of completion. So now that I'm retired, I want to get back to them and see if I can whip them out. And so I've got one that I'm ready to send off, and then I'll be hitting the next one. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. Again, in case you're just joining us, I'm Sarah Soliz, the Director of SAR Press, and I want to welcome you to our book talk on Trumpism, Mexican America, and the Struggle for Latinx Citizenship. We're joined by the editors of the book, and I would like you all to give us a bit of an overview and tell us how it started, and maybe tell us a bit about the work of the other contributors. So would you mind telling us more about the volume and explaining what you mean by Trumpism? And I wonder who would like to start, maybe Felipe?
Okay. So how did this project gestate? It was fall of 2016. The results of the presidential election had been determined. Donald Trump would be the president of the United States. A week later, the School of Advanced Research announced that it was going to be accepting proposals for their advanced seminar series. And so the 3 of us over dinner conceived of the idea of sending a proposal to SAR around the theme of the relationship between President Trump or the Trump administration and Latinos, Latinas, particularly at that time, Mexican and Mexican Americans. We had, in the term that we use in the preface, we had digested the Trump campaign and the campaign in general. And what was very striking, at least from our point of view, was the extent to which candidate Trump had been targeting, we can put it that way, Mexicans and Mexican Americans in particular. I mean, how could anyone forget his comment in the infamous escalator speech when he announced his candidacy for president, when he said that Mexicans were bringing drugs there. Some of them were criminals, and rapists. And so that was sort of an epitome of the fact that, Mexicans in particular were in his crosshairs. And so the basic idea that we had at the time was it would be a great idea to keep tabs on how the presidential administration would be regarding Latinos and Latinas. At that time, it was pretty clear that it was clear to us that what was going on here was Mexican and Mexican Americans. Of course, things got much more complicated once the presidential administration started. So we submitted a proposal to SAR, and basically our basic idea was to see if and how Mexicans and Mexican Americans would figure in the Trump administration, whether or not President Trump would follow through on essentially what were threats to this particular category of people, and if so, how, and what kind of consequences and fallout might follow from that. And so we submitted the proposal. We included a list of scholars that we thought would be ideal for this particular project. The way that we conceived it, by the time our seminar would meet, the Trump administration would be about 2/3 of its way through its term. And so we felt like that would afford us plenty of time to analyze, to document, to scrutinize what was going on in the Trump administration around this particular topic. And so the proposal was accepted. We were happy to hear. We convened in our seminar, and of course, we had a very exciting time with the folks that were able to join us. And then we discussed each other's papers and produced a volume, submitted it to the press, and basically that's how and why we are here today.
I think one of the interesting things about this seminar and the planning of it was that it was, I like to say it was an exercise in futurology, in the sense that at the time we planned the seminar, we actually did not know what we would be talking about 2 years hence. We knew that there would be something to talk about because the Trump presidency represented it looked to us like it represented the beginning of a new phase in the struggle around Mexican American and Latinx citizenship. But we didn't know what the Trump playbook was going to lead him to do around this issue. So we were planning a seminar whose content was unknown to us at the time. And I found that really exhilarating. The other thing we didn't know when we met, I mean, it's hard to imagine now gathering a group in one place, in one room for a week to talk to each other, which is something that at the time we didn't know would become an experience unavailable to us all in a very short time because of the pandemic. So now I think all of us look back on that time as the week we were together there as kind of a treasure, because those kinds of experiences slipped away from our grasp. But I think the idea that the Trump presidency represented a new phase, a new moment in a long struggle, and that, our job in the end turned out to be to look at both to go back and see the strands of the history of that struggle and the strands that Trump was drawing on and Trumpism was drawing on, and at the same time to diagnose what was happening in the present, what the Trump playbook looked like.
Yeah, I think that
Do you want to add something?
What? I think that when we met, we had a sense we were huddled in this room at SAR. We had a sense that this is really urgent. We don't know how this story is going to end. It looks like we all are under assault. And so we felt it was invaluable for us to get to talk with each other was a group that had a lot of expertise in this area. And it was a thing that was altogether too rare to have a whole week to do that. And to feel like the topic was urgent, we had to figure out, we didn't think we would have the last word in the conversation about Trump, but we thought we would have an early word. And we know that an early word can set some directions for other people to follow up. And we felt that there was a lot of responsibility on our shoulders, and that the topic was urgent, and that we needed to talk about this. We thought there was a lot at stake.
Just to pick up on what Mary made, I think SAR, the review committee at SAR should be commended, because we did not say that we were going to be, writing analytical papers over static concept, for example. This was something futuristic, and we were proposing that what was going to happen is that we were going to see what was going to happen, and I think it was probably an unusual way of approaching a seminar proposal. So I think I'm really gratified. I think we are that the review committee was able to see the potential of and the importance of a project such as this, and so I do think that was pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Felipe, did you want to talk about some of the other contributors as well?
Sure. So do you want to put the contents up? Okay, so this is the table of contents, and as it appears in the book. And so there at the top, you'll see the three of us editors mentioned, and chapter number 1 is my contribution. The title is Meta-Violence, Expulsive Nationalism, and Trumpism's Crackdown on Mexican America. And there was a reason for making this the first chapter, because we felt like it laid the foundation for the whole topic of Trumpism and Latinos, Latinas. The second chapter is written by Cristina Beltran, who is at New York University currently. And the chapter that she has written is To Wield and Exceed the Law, Mexicans, Migration, and the Dream of Herman Volk Democracy. And this is a very creative theoretical piece that lays out what it is that is fundamentally going on. White supremacists want to gain power in the United States based on a history of what she identifies as Herman Volk democracy. Chapter 3 is written by David Montejano, who spent his career, the last part of his career, at Berkeley, and the title of his chapter is Deconstructing Trumpism: Lessons from the Recent Past for the New and for the Near Future. A very interesting paper relating the history of conservatism that ended up producing Trumpism, basically. Including the policy ideologies that informed presidential administrations in the past. Next, we have Michelle Garcia, journalist and filmmaker. Michelle, do you want to describe your own chapter?
Yes. Well, it's a great honor to be here, and it was such an honor to be invited to contribute to the volume. My chapter is titled Reckoning with the Gaze, and in it, what I'm trying to dissect is that there's a long-standing tradition in this country that dates back to the mid-early 19th century looking at Latinos, gazing at Mexican Americans, and Trump successfully weaponized that as part of a sort of performance of nationalism. And it was extremely effective because Latinos and Mexican Americans in particular have formed or have existed and occupied the American landscape as side figures and not necessarily as central actors. Given so, you can interpret and reinterpret people how you wish. And there's great power in that. What I did was try to take away that gaze.
Okay, great. Renato's chapter comes next. And Renato, you want to do the honors?
Sure. The title is Artists versus Ideologue. And I don't know what the rest is, and I can't see it. But it's what it is it's a careful comparison of a novel by Elena Maria Viramontes about Los Angeles, about young children, they're late teenagers, I should say. And she explores what happens to them. And it's dystopic. Terrible things happen to them. Their lives are perilous. They're highly vulnerable. And then I compare that dystopian vision with Samuel Huntington, a political scientist at Harvard, who, when I actually read his book with care, horrified me. I was so white supremacist that I couldn't believe it had ever been published. It was irresponsible, it was full of lies, it was distorted. It was a terrible book, but it was a dystopic vision of the United States and the place of Mexican Americans in the United States. And what I was trying to do was by juxtaposing these two visions, these two dystopic visions, I was trying to show what the country was in the grip of.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, was there more, Renato?
Oh, that's it.
Okay.
I was going to say he dicho.
He dicho. All right. That means you have to read it. Chapter 6 is written by Alicia Galvez, who is at the City University of New York. The title of her chapter is I Won't Tell My Story, Narrative Capital and Refusal Among Undocumented Activists in the Trump Era. And just to mention that one of the major themes that is found in the volume across several chapters is the whole issue of resistance. Resistance to Trumpism, but also resistance to subjugation and racism against Latino populations. And so Alicia's chapter is in that spirit and related to undocumented activists and students as reflected in her observations of them at her campus. So one wing of the Latina resistance to racial domination. The next chapter is written by Areli. Areli, you want to describe your chapter?
Okay. Yes, thank you. The title of my chapter was "How Did We Get Here? Central Americans and Immigration Policy from Reagan to Trump." And I think it's a pretty straightforward in the sense that, I think I was writing this in the midst of Trump continuously using social media and his various platforms to draw attention to not only the quote unquote caravans, but the large exodus of Central American migrants, primarily out of Honduras, and also the threats of MS-13 as this sort of, distorted and grotesque, racialized criminal transnational entity. I was writing this chapter in the middle of all that, and I really wanted to, it was an opportunity, I think, to really reflect on what Trumpism really means and how it was executed under Trump, but also draw parallels and also draw historical precedents to obviously the Ronald Reagan administration, and when, the largest, Central American migration really peaked during the Civil Wars, and then even include a look at, the Obama administration and how liberals and also Democratic elected officials sort of continue with the same sort of notions and rhetoric and implement sort of enforcement first, punitive policies when it comes to Central American migrants. So I'm really glad that I was able to contribute and to use this chapter as a way to sort of, root what's happening to Central American migrants in the Mexican American experience, and also sort of give a little bit of insight into how this case was particularly unique and very relevant to how we understand, authoritarianism going forward. So thank you.
Something I just wanted to add about, both Renato's and Arely's paper. There are examples where, looking back from Trumpism, we were living the future of the things that they are describing in their papers. And looking back from Trumpism, for example, at someone like Samuel Huntington, who's writing, who are we, in 2004. There was no way in 2004 to realize where Huntington's, writings were taking us. And looking back, you say, oh my God, we didn't respond. We didn't see the seeds there of where we are now. We didn't react. And you look back and you react now. And the same with the centrality of Central America and Central American migration. What became was super evident in in the 2018s, and it was really quite a rich and amazing experience to look back and see in Arely's work from earlier what the seeds of what was coming, how they were there, and we couldn't have seen them at the time. So it was really an interesting temporality.
Thank you, Mary. Chapter 8 is written by Tomas Jimenez, a sociologist at Stanford University. And the title of his piece is "This Too Shall Pass, Mexican Immigrant Replenishment and Trumpism." And basically, this is something of a sequel to his very well-received sociological study of two Mexican American communities, one in Kansas and one in California, in which he argued that this was a population that was highly acculturated, and nevertheless they were able to maintain their ethnic identity primarily through the strength of the value of multiculturalism, but also quite importantly because of the influx into the communities of Mexican immigrants. And so, one of the things that's mentioned in our volume is the fact that Mexican immigration to the United States, well before Trump was even elected, was a net zero. Mexicans were not coming over, either undocumented or documented. And so, the fact that multiculturalism did not have the ideological force that it once did. And so what Tomas asks is, what is to happen with Mexican American identity, given the fact that we have these two significant changes? And so it's a very interesting discussion of the possibilities including whether or not Trumpism might be a major source of maintaining ethnic identity among a segment of acculturated Mexican Americans. Chapter 9 is written by Ángela Valenzuela, educational sociologist, the University of Texas, Austin. Decolonizing Citizenship, the Movement for Ethnic Studies in Texas. As we know, another aspect of the assault on people of color by conservatives has been in the area of education. The whole issue of critical race theory sort of exemplifies this concern. Ángela has been working in the area of Mexican American studies and the greater field of ethnic studies. And so she, an issue that came up with remarkable controversy in both Arizona and Texas. So what she does is she gives a history of Mexican American studies in particular, and suggests the ways in which it can form resistance to Trumpism. And just to mention in our epilogue, Mary was very much our leader in the construction of the epilogue. That's the volume in summary.
I would just say about Ángela Valenzuela's paper, it's another one where you're looking back on the struggle over curriculum as a battlefield, and we at the time of the seminar wouldn't have been able to anticipate that critical race theory would become this target that would the next target of the curricular arsenal. And it was just, so hers is another one that has that really interesting anticipatory power in it.
As we jump into the Q&A, I wanted to welcome Michelle García and Areli Zimmerman into the conversation, two of the contributors, and remind everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A, anything that you would like to discuss with the editors and contributors. Paul comments that there's a relatively new book out called Inventing Latinos, a New Study of American Racism by Laura Gomez. And I think I'll just start off by asking, you begin the book by asking what it means to belong to a modern society and nation state or territorial state. And I wonder if you could talk more about what that means in terms of Latino history in the United States and then under Trumpism. Mary, do you want to start?
Well, when we were envisioning the seminar, we focused, we chose to focus in on this question of citizenship as our point of entry into the conversation, largely because the problematic around citizenship and citizenship understood broadly, not just as who has the passport or the papers, but the whole question of belonging and status has been at the center, was one of the axes of Mexican American and Latino studies in the United States, quite rightly so. So there existed already a rich theoretical literature about the problematic of citizenship. Renato had created a concept of cultural citizenship that had generated a big literature, and many other scholars. And so the problematic of citizenship proved to be a really constructive way to approach the question, partly in part because Trumpism was trying to create non-citizens or target non-citizens. And it had what this Felipe called expulsive nationalism, these dramas, putting on these dramas of expulsion to kind of perform an idea of citizenship. And that's where Cristina Beltran's theory of what's called in political theorists are calling Herrenvolk democracy. The term comes from the theoretical apparatus developed to study apartheid. but the idea of Herrenfolk democracies, it's a democracy in which the democratic structure of a class of citizenships is predicated on their ability to subjugate another group. And that subjugation becomes the condition of their citizenship, the premise of their citizenship. And she wants to argue that model is kind of the premise of American democracy. So it's a way, so whiteness is not just an ethnic or racial category, it's a political project in which your standing as a citizen is performed and exists. Your standing as a citizen is given to you through your power to subjugate others. And you are allowed, when you act on that power, like when you go into a Walmart to shoot Mexicans like someone did, or when you enact a deportation law, as others did, at any level of sort of existence, you can enact that power as in a civic way. So we were very struck by, all of us, by the kind of use Trumpism made of cruelty. And many people have noticed this in kind of performances of cruelty. So the caging of children at the border, these kinds of things. And Beltran made the claim that there's an affective quality to that, and that those performances of cruelty or abuse have a civic act in a certain way. And so this was one of the, this theoretical model was very enabling for us to understand how Trump was able to mobilize people's feelings and their passions, right, and their affect, and as well as how he was able to make conflict and aggression meaningful to people as part of their citizenship. You guys can flesh it out if you want.
Yeah,
Who would like to add to that?
there are, whenever these major, historically, I mean, the whole issue of citizenship has perennially arisen. And to establish not only, legal status as written down on a piece of paper, but also a sense of belonging, which is a very, very important part of what citizenship is all about. Now, one of the things that recurs in our volume is how it is that the people who are subject to marginalization and to basically, expulsion from the community of citizens in the United States is extremely important. And so we have at least three major ways in which people of Spanish-speaking, Spanish surname descent establish their sense of belongingness. So there's Raymond Rocco's associative citizenship, which basically argues that when thousands of people gather together in order to make clear their rights of belonging in the United States, that is one of the ways that that a sense of belongingness is established. Renato's own concept of cultural citizenship is another form, building community, living your lives in the United States, regardless of the ascriptive categorization of these communities. The very sense of building culture and community within the confines of the boundaries of the country is another example of this. Sarah Song's notion of collective self-governance, citizenship as collective self-governance, again, similar to Rocco's associative citizenship. When people collect together in a way that not only strives to gain leverage for their particular rights, material or whatever, but when they impact American institutions, then basically they have they have established their right to belong, in a sense, established their sense of citizenship in the country. And one of the examples that can be seen or realized is how it is that undocumented students created the sanctuary movement. So these were undocumented, young people who were the force behind the whole concept of sanctuary. And sanctuary became an extremely important value and norm in American universities and colleges, in cities, and even in states. An excellent example of collective self-governance. So those are some of the ways the citizenship concept is interwoven in the stories that we tell.
One of the things we did with the Cultural Citizenship Project is that we tried talking to people. And obviously, a non-starter would be, how is your cultural citizenship doing today? People would throw up their hands, look puzzled. But if we ask, can you tell me if you've ever felt like a second-class citizen? They would go on and on and on. They had a great deal to say about that. And we'd ask them to explore it, tell me a story about it, go into it in greater depth. One woman had been part of a spiritual group. And she said, the reason I worked to form this group is that I realized that in my church, I was participating in rituals of my own exclusion. I said, wow, I get paid for talking like that. And here's this woman just living her life who has an awareness of citizenship as belonging, being first class, second class, full citizen, being demeaned. And there's a great deal to explore in that area.
I think there's a sense and I think Latinx studies and Mexican American studies have really led the way on this. There's a sense of seeing citizenship as a real terrain of struggle within the United States, that you have the foundational Herrenvolk model, which was built on the exclusion and the subjugation of through chattel slavery, through Indian removal, through all these colonial policies. And then you have the struggles of people, those of people who are excluded, and to assert themselves and gain a foothold. And that's this terrain of struggle is incredibly, it's to this day, it's incredibly dynamic. Now it's going on between vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, right? And so the dynamism of that really helped, I think, inform our conversation. And one of the things that we realized, and Michelle was really, her work is very important in this way, is that Latinx people, as you know, when Mexican Americans became Mexican Americans, not by migrating here, but by being here, and being when Texas became part of, and the Southwest became part of the U.S. So Beltran makes the point that their status has been ambiguous in a way that has enabled the critique of the white supremacist model to come from the ambiguous position that Latinx people, and Mexican Americans in particular, have occupied in this struggle.
Michelle, do you want to add to that?
I do. I think it's important to understand what I think is a significant, what makes this volume a significant contribution is that, as Mary was mentioning, you have, African American slavery, you have Native American genocide. Those are recognizable injustices, cruelties, and violence in this country. That does not exist when it comes to Latinos, and in part because of the question of immigration. The violence, the lynching, the decades of marginalization does not occupy a role in the public imaginary, which again, as I said earlier, makes it easy to then manipulate. And I think you see that absence when you think about, for example, Sonia Sotomayor's dissent, her separate opinion in the DACA ruling, in which she scolded the fellow justices who were unwilling and unable to recognize that Trump's anti-Mexican rhetoric was discriminatory. And Justice Sotomayor said that they had glossed over this, they'd papered over it, they'd brushed it aside and didn't recognize it as racism. So here we are in 2021, and you have justice from the Supreme Court saying this is unrecognizable to people. And when that occurs, you can do all sorts of horrible things and have it be repackaged and reinterpreted. And I think a perfect example of that is, as was mentioned earlier, the massacre in El Paso, one of the worst massacres, mass shootings in the history of the United States, the worst of Latinos. And yet after it occurred, and in which Mexicans and Mexican Americans both were casualties, victims, but in the aftermath to that, what happens? That shooting is analyzed and interpreted as an example of toxic masculinity, as eco-terrorism, as a gun rights issue. There was an inability to discuss and debate what anti-Mexican, anti-Latino sentiment looks like and how it operates. And I wrote about this. What you saw was this person claiming that they were going out to drive 10 hours to shoot people and kill people because of what was happening in his area electorally, that Latinos within the borders of Texas were gaining political power, and this was a way to beat back at this. So if you think about it, your problem is the political direction of your region, and what do? You go to the border to fight. And that comes from an unexamined, misunderstood sort of practice in this country that both Trump, but many people before him have seized on to promote violence and to create that sense of national unity. And in response to this, I think, and one of the things I critique in my paper is that Mexican Americans, Latinos have responded to this by presenting themselves for inspection, by offering up their bona fides, by asking to have their citizenship examined, rather than, and as I argue, what we ought to be doing is looking at that nature of that gaze, that violent gaze, how it operates, and speaking back to it, and that there have been examples of that across time. And that has been forgotten in many ways, I think.
I think that makes a good segue. We've gotten a few questions, and one of them from David and Eileen says, I would be interested in the panelists' views on the post-Trump Biden administration's approach to Mexican American or Latinx issues. Who would like to address that? Felipe or Mary?
I think Felipe has been thinking about that a lot.
You're muted, Felipe.
Well, certainly the border has become a major issue in the Biden administration, and how he has gone about, taking care of issues that were so unhealthy and oppressive on the border is something that's quite difficult. And I think that the administration has probably found it much more difficult than he thought it was going to be. So there's a certain sense in which the effect of the kind of policies and actions he has taken are reminiscent of some of the approaches that took place in his friend's administration, President Obama. I mean, one of the things that I think is very interesting is how now relations between the United States and Mexico are caught up in these. There are new developments occurring in Mexico around the question, especially of Central American appearances on the border. And so right now there seems to be a kind of a stalemate going on along the border, and how it is that that's going to be resolved is going to be a very important, a very important question, I think.
Arely, if you're still there, I think you probably have something to say about this.
I think the only thing, when I saw the question, the thing that sticks most in my mind right now, and I think the collective imagination of many Central Americans across different ideological, sort of spectrum, is, the vice president, traveling to Central America as one of the first major, right, messages sent from the Biden administration about where they stand on that issue. And that really, I think, set the tone, and I think, for how it's the sort of an aggressive, right? Like she did a tour of the region, and the message was, don't come, you're not welcome, and this is where, it's very similar to what I talked about in my chapter, which is the rhetoric that Obama used was very much about this kind of, humanistic approach, right? In which it was like, we care about you, please don't risk this. But in that same vein, criminalizing, the moms, the mothers, the parents, the children that to dare confront and challenge the notion of American sovereignty by crossing borders and doing so collectively, So to me, Mary, that's the thing that is still sort of very prominent, and I don't know what you all thought of that, or if you guys saw that, but I think that was that definitely there was disillusionment from a lot of folks with that move.
It just occurred to me on another level. I mean, at least President Biden has attended to diversity, and which has included, the appointment of Mexican Americans, Javier Becerra, for example, to his cabinet, and also Deborah Holland, Native American. So at least there is that, it was pointed out that President Trump paid absolutely no attention to this whole question. Did not concern him one bit, because President Trump was in a mode of dividing the country and fomenting social conflict rather than trying to bring people together or to affect any kind of inclusion. So I think that probably deserves some mention too.
I think that relates to another question we have from Michael, who asks, are there people missing from the book who you would have liked to have talked about, such as asylum seekers who are still in Mexico, or even Muslim groups or others that you might have liked to have included, but just couldn't for this project. Renato, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, yes, we kept thinking of other groups that we would love to have included, and we've thought of ways in which an analysis of their situation would feed the book as a whole. Muslims, certainly. But we discovered that when you're doing a small anthology, that you just have a finite amount of space. And that may not be a full answer, but I think one thing I would like to have seen is astounding areas of ignorance on the part of high officials. I thought when the vice president for Biden went to Central America, what most astounded me was how she didn't know anything about it. She didn't know who was who. She didn't know the viciousness of the people in Guatemala she was talking to. She just, it was kind of astonishing to me. And I was asking, why couldn't they at least get somebody who knows a lot about these countries to prep her, to be her tutor as she goes, to say, the man you're talking to now, and describe whatever he's done. So I've been rather astounded about that. And I think I was astounded at how Biden working on the border didn't seem to know anything about it. And I think that one thing that would have been fascinating to me, although a lot of this is developments that happened after Biden's election, but I think would have been, what is it that our high officials don't know? How come they don't know this? Why didn't they call the experts? Anyway, that would be something I would have loved to have done.
I think one place where the question of other groups comes in was we realized, and this again goes back to Samuel Huntington and a sort of group of right-wing thinkers coming out of Milton Friedman in the 90s and the 2000s, was that Huntington in particular posed the Latino threat, as R.D. calls it, as a civilizational issue. That, and he in Who Are We, he put forth the idea of the vision of a country that would actually have two different civilizations, a Spanish-speaking one and an English-speaking one, an Anglo-Saxon Protestant one and a Latinx Catholic one. And he thought that this was going to destroy the country. And that vision created the possibility of Mexican Americans in particular, but and Latinx people in general, becoming this target as a civilizational thing. And that was the threat. And that was the internal threat. Latinos were the internal threat to American civilization, and Muslims were the external threat. And that idea of clash of civilizations and of civilizational conflict was part of what was part of the engine that drove this whole structure of affect and belief and practices.
I think couldn't predict what was going to happen. We certainly couldn't predict hurricanes. And so we were able to include 2 or 3 paragraphs on the experience of Puerto Ricans and how it was that Trump just totally, dismissed the importance of the Puerto Rican people in the context of Hurricane Maria. So I think that it occurred to me that it would be great to have a Puerto Rican scholar or a scholar on Puerto Rico to be a part of the team. We weren't able to do that, but of course, at least we felt like we, paid tribute to the fact that they too came under President Trump's sort of style of degrading people of Latina descent.
Yeah, he put on display their second-class citizenship. He, he enacted that while everybody watched.
And there were conventional politicians in Puerto Rico who were saying like, we're totally colonized. These were moderate Republicans. Who were saying that, we're totally oppressed as a colonized people. So it definitely affected the rhetoric in the political field on the island.
Margaret says, thank you for coming together today and starting a conversation on citizenship. Where does sexuality or gender come into your theory and understanding of citizenship, or Christina's in the volume?
I think that was also another of the places where we weren't able to have enough people in the seminar that we weren't able to address satisfactorily, and we knew that at the time, because you could see under Trump that this need to constantly create targets was obviously was being inflicted on gay and lesbian and trans people and the whole LGBT world, and that he was articulating a kind of masculinity, what we now started calling toxic masculinity. He was creating that as part of a gendered model of citizenship. But I agree. I think that's something we didn't address. The book doesn't address it adequately. I don't know what the rest of you think.
I will. In the whole phenomenon, I'm sorry, let me just very quickly here. In the whole phenomenon of anti-Trumpism, as we call it, in the midterm elections, there was a whole slew of women who were elected to Congress, and some of them were, Latino Latinas. Teresa Leger Fernandez in New Mexico was a very important instance, and so there was, in terms of resistance, a very important representation of women in the field. I will also mention just very quickly that these explosive white supremacists, I mean, women could be just as just as rhetorically violent as the men now, as is pointed out in one instance of the accosting of someone who was speaking Spanish in another Walmart site in Phoenix, and then there was a woman who was mentioned who, in like form, accosted an Asian American young woman in a public space. So just to mention those two examples.
Well, I'd like to add. I'd like to add that I think these all are in many ways connected. The question of, for example, the border and gender issues. I mean, the border is long ago transcended any geographic space. I mean, what Phillip was just describing is we have internal checkpoints all over this country now, in which Latinos and others are constantly being subjected to inspection. For example, are you speaking Spanish? I also think that what I came away and from this working on this project and how it's really edified me since then is that we're using Trumpism as a term, a vocabulary for something that, when we're talking about a threat to civilization, you see this in the letter that Stephen F. Austin wrote in the 1800s during the quote unquote Texas Revolution, in which he writes, are we to be governed by this mongrel race, by these blacks? I mean, it was already characterized as clash civilizations already and what needed to be done. And this continues to this day. In the state of Texas and other places, people are outright about their unwillingness and their fear of being governed by unworthy people. So Trump really crystallized and gave us a sort of focal point to something that is so pervasive. And on the question, and really coalesced around him the question of gender, of masculinity. We see this right now on the border with Governor Abbott's detention arrest of Central Americans, mainly charging them with criminal trespass. That's not happening to the women and the children. They're picking just the men. So you see this confrontation between Texas lawmen and these, people from somewhere else. What should concern us is that thus far, there is only one way to conceptualize the border, and that is in a commonly understood way and symbolism, which is as a place of division, of white supremacy, of imperialism. And there is no response to that by the Democrats, by the other side. It is still seen as a line in the sand of immigration. And there is no, and I'm working on that right now in terms of a book about borders, which is how do you take back the border?
Renato, did you want to add something?
Well, I think the only thing I'd add is that we really need some work that's systematically analyzing the issues presented in the volume in terms of gender and sexuality. There just has to be a more thoughtful analysis of this. It's missing from the book, and you can always plead we can't do everything, but I think it's a serious deficit in our analysis, and we should work on it, not leave it to other people.
So a number of people have asked versions of this question, and I think it's a good place to wrap up. And the question is, what about the future of Trumpism? And I would just add to that, the future of Trumpism, but also what ideas about resistance and maybe hope can we take from the book?
Well, I'd say one thing about that, which is I think the summer of 2020 was very important because it made clear to me, and this was the takeaway from the seminar too, their struggle over citizenship in the United States. There is the Herrenvolk model of the white supremacist and people defending their privilege, and that formation being something that unites poor white people and rich white people in a single place. But there's also, and we saw this in the huge demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd, that there are many, perhaps many white people who are standing up for an inclusive model of citizenship that doesn't do that. Those demonstrations were in the summer of 2020, I think showed a different scenario. This was not about white people in solidarity or in coalitions. It wasn't that politics anymore. It was white people out there saying, I don't want to live in a white supremacist society. I don't want it for me and my children. I don't want it for you either. But and I felt that was the people standing up for and out there for a model of inclusive citizenship that really was an alternative to what was being proposed, and enacted in the attack on the Capitol and so on. So there's always been a struggle over citizenship, but I think it's taking that form. And I was watching a brief video clip the other day of a drama on a JetBlue flight in which a young couple, white couple, was refusing to wear their masks, and they were the crew were trying to get them to leave the plane. And they were trying to incite the other passengers into solidarity with them. And, this is my freedom, my right, and so on. And all the people on the plane were yelling, get off the plane, get off the plane. And it was like the struggle was right there over what model we're going to have socially. And I just feel it's getting enacted in our everyday lives as well as in our politics. And so I think that, to me, that struggle is going to what I see as kind of unfolding here. Are we going to do we have the inclusive model, or is this other hierarchical model based on subjugation of one group by another going to prevail? So that's my 2 cents worth on that future.
Yeah, I mean, it's so it looks like, for a while now, this battle between the advocates of sort of a liberal state and government versus a tribalistic attempt to restrict the definition of the nation to white folks, that's going to be with us for a while. And so, and that's a very, fascinating and extremely significant battle. So that we have, the white nativist victories in Texas, restricting voting, for example, and the whole, attempt to institutionalize vigilantism with the abortion issue. David Montejano points to the very fascinating comparison between Texas and California. So in California, then we see the victory of Governor Newsom to be able to survive the attempt to bring him down. Where Mexican Americans and Central Americans and Puerto Ricans, and then what direction they go, and this whole contention is going to be a very interesting thing. And so, we have reports of, Mexican, Tejanos and Mexican Americans in South Texas who are, a certain percentage of them are headed in the direction of Trumpism, the whole question of whiteness, and as claimed by Latinos and Latinas is one that is addressed a little summarily, but still addressed by Cristina Beltran. I mean, these are fascinating questions that and fundamental and important ones that we're going to be witness to and participating in as well.
I think that one of the lessons of the book to me is that we've got to take seriously what's happening, the struggles of Latinx people. And I think that they somehow move out of the line of vision. And what I think the book shows, any reader of it, what the book shows is that these struggles of Latinx people are central to the populace as a whole in the United States. And it's kind of like the lessons we learn by looking carefully at these matters are lessons we all, whether white or not, African American or not, we need to be studying them with care because they're instructive for everybody.
Just a quick footnote comment. Michelle addresses this question of the choices that maybe she was already going to mention that, but much of her paper deals with exactly the kinds of political choices that especially Mexican Americans are going to be making in the future. Just wanted to mention that. Plug.
Michelle, did you want to add something?
I do, which is I think too, we have to, what I think is exciting is that Latinos, Latinx, we are of any race, Afro-Latino, we're a mix of indigenous and African and European. And in many ways, what I think we see happening right now is this country was founded by imposing very rigid lines of which Latinos in many ways do not abide by, do not conform to. And so how are we going to continue this conversation about nationally about Latinos in this immigration? Or do we, as I think happens in this volume, which is these conversations move us toward that multiracial democracy. They move us toward a multiracial national identity, one that transcends borders, with the border being the geographic space that symbolizes those rigid lines. And this makes people, I think, on the left and on the right very uncomfortable, but ultimately really paves the way forward for us. And so I think when we're able to understand when we talk about Latinos, Latinx, we are talking about the profile of the country. Who do we want to be? And I think that can be very exciting right now. We need to see that as a positive too.
Natalie, did you want to add anything?
I think Michelle said it perfectly, and I'm still sort of on this idea of gender as well, and sexuality, because I think race is articulated through gender and vice versa. So when looking at Central American migration, I sort of allude to it a few times throughout the chapters that even though we see, publicly in terms of Trump and his rhetoric towards immigrants and anti-immigrants as really rooted in sort of Latino threats as being male, much of the policies really are aimed at women and children. And there's been a lot of great scholarship on that. And in the Central American case, Sara Riva, for example, has a great piece and is working on work that addresses how much Central American women are targeted as threats as well through sort of a gendered lens. So, but I definitely appreciate the question, and I hope that this volume will generate these conversations and generate more work that enriches what we attempted to do in this volume humbly.
Yeah, another really great topic that's waiting for us is what these possibilities, what are their implications in terms of our ability, the way we are able, or the way we choose to address climate catastrophe, which is the urgent thing that is. I'm up in Canada right now, and it's the subject of the election here that's underway right now. And in the US, it's still hasn't acquired yet the centrality that it's going to have to acquire. And all these questions are going to be tied up hugely with what we enable ourselves to do around those issues.
Any final thoughts? By the book.
By the book. Read the book.
I would like to thank everyone who put a question in, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but I really appreciate the participation. I want to send a huge thank you to everyone who joined us, everyone who donated to support this event, the panelists, and the staff at SAR who made this book talk possible. We have a few events coming up that I would like to tell you about. Our Scholar Colloquia series starts next Wednesday, and that will include our two Mellon Fellows in Latinx Studies. We have Pierrette Ondagnu Sotelo, whose recent book, South Central Dreams, Finding Home and Building Community in South LA, co-authored with Manuel Pastor. She will be speaking on Tuesday, October 5th at 2 p.m. And then we also have Elise Waterston and Charlotte Hollins, collaborators on Light in Dark Times, The Human Search for Meaning, which is a writerly, artistic, and anthropological collaboration. It's a graphic novel. And they will be speaking on Thursday, October 14th at 2 p.m. Our next SAR book talk on designs and anthropologies, frictions and affinities will take place on Wednesday, November 10th at 10 a.m. Mountain. And you can find more information about all of these events at sarweb.org. Click on the calendar or join us online. And I just want to say thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.